welcome. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. My name is Katherine Griffin, founder and CEO of Impactable, a data analytics platform for impact intelligence. And today I'm so delighted to be joined by Richard Johnson, COO at Good Call Tech, a suite of technologies designed to enable access to legal support at critical points in the arrest process, as well as Chris Bentley, the GP at the De-Carceration Fund, an early-stage impact fund that invests in the ethical disruption of the criminal justice system. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. I want to start by giving you both an opportunity to introduce your work. Richard, let's start with you. Just if you could, just tell us a little bit more about the origin story of Good Call. Like, what prompted you and Jelani to build it? And give us a feel for where the company is today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us, Catherine. So I can't talk about Good Call Technologies without first speaking about goodcall.org, which is our nonprofit. The nonprofit started 8 years ago as a means to combat the criminal justice system by getting in front of the arrest process, specifically at the point of arrest, pre-arraignment, to serve as kind of the pipeline to stop people from being overly policed and incarcerated. We surveyed the community, and the one thing that people needed and wanted was access to counsel before they were speaking to a judge at arraignment, because studies have shown that people are twice as likely to be released on their own recognizance with early legal intervention. The nonprofit was operating 6 years successfully in New York. We expanded from the Bronx to all 5 boroughs in New York City. And I believe in 2001, we were invited to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which was a big competition nationwide that pulled organizations, nonprofits from all over the country. Correct me, it wasn't just nonprofits, social justice organizations from all across the country to compete in this competition, to see which which organization was going to create sweeping impact across the country. Of course, we won. Prior to us winning the U.S. Conference of Mayors, we were operating in somewhat of a bubble. We knew that there was criminal justice issues and bail issues with respect to New York City and New York State, but at the time, again, we were operating in a bubble. We didn't realize that early legal intervention and access to counsel was such a painstaking issue across the country. We knew that there was a deprivation, but we didn't know the inner workings of what was happening in a lot of these other states and jurisdictions. In a lot of these other areas, early legal intervention doesn't exist. It's kind of a fantasy in these legal deserts. A lot of the things that we take for granted in New York City is a dream in a lot of these other places. So upon winning the U.S. Conference of Mayors, we got a lot of engagement and we got a lot of questions and inquiries of people wanting to bring our access to counsel technology, specifically our IVR, which is hotline technology, and our dashboard technology to their jurisdictions because of the deprivations that I just mentioned. And we left the conference, myself, our CEO, Jelani Anglin, and our Chief Impact Officer, Kim Belizaire. We left the conference kind of in this almost bittersweet mindset. Obviously sweet because we won, but bitter because it was really eye-opening for us to realize just how, I guess, handicapped or antiquated a lot of these legal service providers and public defense networks have been operating and literally trying to provide access to counsel to their communities and their societies. And so we had an aha moment, and we thought to ourselves, like, why not spread all the success and technology that we have developed in New York City? Why not try and make that available to the rest of the country and hopefully the world at some point? Because as we know, policing is worldwide. And so why not try and replicate this in other cities and states in order to bridge the technology gap, but also the access to counsel gap for many system impact and marginalized communities. And so Good Call Technologies was born. Um, Good Call Technologies, our focus is providing IVR, innovative, secure, and reliable IVR and CRM technology to not only legal service providers, but emergency response organizations as well. Because in our research into the legal service provider realm, we realize that it's not just legal service providers, obviously, that are running emergency hotlines, but you have disaster relief organizations, you have resource distribution organizations, anti-violence coalitions, and a lot of the work, although different, the need for this technology is very similar across these different sectors. And so that's honestly kind of what kind of led us down this path. Where we are now is we are, I think, maybe 10 days away from completing our MVP, which is extremely exciting. And so we're kind of just in this testing, improving phase, because once the MVP is complete, we're going to be running tests through our nonprofit, because obviously we've been providing legal access to counsel for the last 8 years. So what better way to test the technology than in already bustling sector, that being New York City. And then from there, we already have we have a network of anti-violence coalitions and organizations in New York City, the tri-state area, and on the West Coast, as well as legal service provider entities, city and state level, that we have agreements with on the East Coast, as well as very, as of recently, maybe I think last week, two jurisdictions that have shown budding interest in providing or utilizing our technology to help provide access to counsel for their individuals, for their communities, excuse me.
Wow, Richard, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And welcome to those who have just joined us. Please, as this conversation proceeds, feel free to add questions to the chat or comments or raise your hand. We love for this to be as interactive as possible. And I know lots of you are other players in the justice tech space. And so we'd love to get your take and your perspective and your questions into the conversation. So Chris, tell us a little bit more about the De-Carceration Fund. I mean, of all of the impact verticals, I think justice tech is one of the most lesser known. And I think it's often assumed that technology for criminal justice, that all of criminal justice it would be handled by the public sector, right? So can you tell us a little bit more about justice tech as a vertical and why you chose to mount a fund to invest in it?
Sure. So a little bit of history. I've been working in the impact investing space, mostly in early stage work, since about 2006. First with groups called Sustain VC, and then later with Serious Change Investments, a fund managed by Josh Mailman. And in this time, was investing in everything from energy and environment, education, access to healthcare, financial mobility. But along the way, ended up making, I guess, a handful of investments in companies that touched on issues tied to the criminal legal system. So one was a company that was trying to bring educational programming into prisons and jails. Another was a company founded by a formerly incarcerated individual that was focused on making it easier to maintain connections with loved ones while incarcerated. A number of companies that were focused on fair chance hiring and hiring returning citizens. And my first sort of quick response was, well, why isn't there a justice tech sector? Why doesn't that exist in the impact investing conferences that we go to? But then it actually became more about, well, why has, by and large, the for-profit private sector been so awful in the space, right? The vast majority of for-profit companies that operate in this world are either perpetuating a bad system or extracting dollars from those that can least afford it. And what would it look like to find business models that were actually aligned with the kind of outcomes that we want to have? And began spending a lot of time focusing on that, and ended up deciding that this was worth moving out and starting something to do just that. And so left Serious Change Investments to start working on the De-Carceration Fund in January of 2020. Of course, in February of 2020, the world changed quite a bit, and I went, "Oh gosh, what have I done?" But I basically spent that time sort of building out what this would look like and understanding where impact opportunities exist. Right, justice tech, by itself, these solutions can reduce incarceration rates. They can support reentry. They can reduce suffering to individuals and communities being impacted by the system. But there's also sort of more far-reaching, opportunities as well, right? Poverty and mass incarceration are inextricably linked, right? There's a higher correlation between poverty rates in states and incarceration rates than there is between crime and incarceration rates, right? That's crazy that we live in this world when that comes down to things like what Richard's working on, access to representation, the way cash bail works in this country, the way policing works in low income areas, right? There's lots of issues there that tie those two. There's also an incredible connection between the public health in this country and incarceration rates broadly, not just among the individuals that are directly impacted by the system. And so there's far-reaching opportunities for impact. And this is really one of the few areas around social justice investing where there are some really meaningful, important, scalable opportunities that can also create massive impact. And that's sort of what led me to focus on this space.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So I'd like to talk a little bit about impact measurement and management, right? That's why we're here. And I'm so happy you both have taken the time to join this conversation because for those of you who don't know, Good Call is one of De-Carceration Fund's portfolio companies. And so we have this unique opportunity to hear the perspective from both sides of the table on impact measurement and management. And from like what I hear quite often is this gap, this real gap in perspectives, right? So the founders, the operators, the folks who are so busy building and selling products and services, and tracking the KPIs that are, important to them, versus the funders, the investors who need to report across their portfolio efficiently and don't want to be onerous, right? And so, I'm curious from both of you, do you all see and experience a gap here, in your own day-to-day lives and in the field more broadly? And if so, where, how, and why? And then, what do you think maybe we might be able to do to eliminate the gap, if so?
Would you like to go first?
Chris, take it away.
Okay. I mean, I think that, when looking at this, the key point you talk about here is that the portfolio companies this is a pretty heavy lift. So looking at opportunities to streamline processes is very important. Also, clear communication up front, like what is expected from the portfolio companies, what is expected from the investor side, and how can they work together to get the most value. Both groups get the most value out of it. I'm a pretty big supporter of sort of tailored metrics and sort of one size fits all approaches. And so really getting into understanding what the solution is that the company is trying to resolve, why that's an important solution, how it's going to work, how can you demonstrate the efficacy of that. All that stuff is sort of really critical in the due diligence anyways for these companies. And so sort of taking that to the next level and making sure, how can both sides get value out of impact measurement and management systems is really important.
Cheers to Chris. So Metrics was very difficult and still is a little difficult when it comes to the justice space because it is budding. There's a lot of time and investment, quite literally investment that needs to kind of go into this budding space in order for any of us to see any sort of movement or development. Um, and I can speak from the good call perspective that because of the type of work that we do, it is or has been very difficult to kind of track a lot of those metrics because of the traumas that are associated with trying to obtain a lot of that data. Um, in a lot of situations, it's easy to track a user journey just because you're dealing with products, services, people are more willing to engage with surveys and things like that. But specifically for the work that Good Call does, we have user satisfaction surveys that, I think maybe 20% of our users will probably fill out, but it doesn't really capture kind of the crux of the issue and also the outcome. In a lot of these instances, we will try to reach out to a lot of our users to kind of just follow their journey, their path. What has life been like post arrest, post incarceration, and kind of just what are the highs and lows of that experience? And I think 8 to 9 times out of 10, people don't even want to talk to us. And it's not because they're not satisfied with the work that we provide or the services that we provided them with. It's quite literally because it is super traumatic. There are stories that I could share with you that would probably pull at your heartstrings and make you cry because a lot of these people don't want to be reminded of the experience that they had at the hands of law enforcement for these people that are actually meant to protect you. It's super disheartening, and it creates a mistrust not just in law enforcement and the system, but well, in the system overall, even those that are trying to help you. It creates a stigma, it creates a fear that you really can't trust anyone, that people that at every end, people are working in with one another in order to hinder your ability, to deprive you of your rights. And so when it comes to impact metrics, when Chris introduced us to Catherine, it was very much an aha moment because as technology advances on the wide spectrum, VCs and foundations are becoming far more rigid and stringent with their expectations of organizations because of the resources that they have available to them in order to make informed decisions. Where in this area, in the justice space, a lot of these organizations, because the space is so new, a lot of these organizations are very young. We don't have the capabilities to invest in resources to properly track outcome data. I mean, sure, there's SurveyMonkey and MailChimp and these things like that, but when you're trying to find or source the longevity of your products or your services on users that have gone through something so traumatic, that type of maybe traditional data, those traditional data points or channels are not going to work. And so again, when Chris introduced us to Catherine, it was an aha moment because Impactable X and what Catherine does has been able to compound primary and finite data in order to help a lot of these budding businesses illustrate what their products can do at this point in time without available resources to them. Obviously, as organizations receive more funding from VCs or foundations, we can kind of direct a lot of those resources to better tracking outcome data. But I honestly, I can't really imagine working in this space now, having utilized a tool like Impactable X. I can't imagine working in this space without incorporating this tool and impact metrics into our strategic planning. It's kind of been a guiding light and a huge decision maker for a lot of the conversations that we're having, not just with investors and foundations, but also even with clients, prospective clients that we're trying to acquire. Because Good Call has a B2B, business to business, and B2G, business to government pipeline, having a tool like Impactable X, being able to measure metrics in the way that it does, quantifying it in a language that we all understand, money, fiscal impact, because as we know, in generally speaking, money is freedom. We have to associate money with freedom. It gives us access to things. And utilizing a tool like Impactable X, being able to kind of illustrate what or how our products are affecting people in such a universal language has been a game changer for us, even in conversations when speaking to public defense agencies and a lot of these governmental agencies, because a lot of them claim that, I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic. I'm sure there are a lot of governmental figures and agencies that actually do care about their citizens and their communities, but holding on or trying to use their emotions and society as a foundation to communicate impact hasn't been effective. There's so many different ideas. There's so many different ideas and organizations in the social justice tech space. And although all different, they're all kind of communicated in the same manner. There is a template, there is kind of there is an outline that these organizations kind of had to adhere to in order to communicate their impact to investors and clients. But the one thing that has kind of been very defining and new in this space has been impact metrics, because it offers a way for us to communicate the effects of our product with creating freedom, but also how there has been a deprivation of freedom. It allows us to quantify that and communicate that in a way where everyone can understand, that being the universal language of currency.
Yeah, so that's a great point, and one I'd like to put a finer point on, because I think impact measurement and management is often thought of in the context of compliance, right? Of investor reporting or corporate reporting. And it doesn't often get thought of as a point of value itself, right? And so you or it's thought of as sort of a nice to have, like, I'm being a good corporate citizen. And what I've found is that when an organization has product-based impact, sells products and services that themselves drive impact, that the impact is often the value proposition, right? That the customer is purchasing resource efficiency or improved outcomes. And so to be able to articulate the degree to which you can do either or both can be extremely helpful for sales. And that's what I heard you speaking to, Richard. And I know you as you sell into governments, right? And so being able to articulate the degree to which the outcomes you drive, reduced pretrial detention predominantly in your case, can create major cost savings for these municipalities, taxpayer dollars. And we all know the kind of budget constraints. And so, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is there a business case for impact measurement and management, and what sort of like misunderstanding are you seeing, or I guess what's your experience? And it sounds like it's really directly been around sales.
Yeah, it's been around sales. So prior to utilizing impact metrics, we were kind of at a disadvantage when communicating to governmental clients and agencies, mainly because outcome data has been so difficult to track. We're kind of just hoping that we're hoping that they would just be willing to accept our pleas, our emotions to some degree, and maybe some like user journeys, not user journeys, user experience testimonials that we have. And although fruitful and accurate, when speaking to a lot of these large agencies, that's not really landing for them. It's not resonating anything. And not to say that they're bad people, there are multiple reasons why they're viewing the space or a lot of these organizations from the vantage point that they are. They, given their positions, they have to look at things from 30,000 feet up, an overarching perspective, which is very understandable. I think us, specifically Good Call, we're kind of at a point now where we're no longer really fighting back with I guess their parameters for a lot of these agencies. We're more so just trying to rise to their expectations in order to push the agenda forward. It's really just about meeting people where they're at, because these processes and these systems have been around before me, before a lot of our times. And as we know, it's not going to change, at least anytime soon. And so we very much kind of just have to work with what we have, infiltrate the system through the avenues that we're able to, and kind of take it from there. One thing that, and I have to really commend De-Carceration Project for this, because they kind of pushed us to do this, was work on communicating the impact metrics, not just in a way that it speaks to the arrestee, or sorry, I'm being very specific, I'm being hyperbolic, to the end user, the individual, but also speak about how it does benefit the jurisdiction itself, the jurisdiction as a person, the jurisdiction as an individual. Because again, when it comes to the bigger picture, a lot of the time they're really just focused on money. And if you're able to communicate a cost-saving structure to a lot of these agencies, they'll be more than willing to mask it under, oh, we're creating justice, we're creating access accounts for our citizens because we care, et cetera, their script. So yeah, no, working with B2G, the impact metrics has been a tremendous catalyst for kind of pushing a lot of these deals through the pipeline.
Chris, anything you want to add to that from what you've seen?
No, I mean, just, to highlight that, it's so much more powerful going in to a discussion and not just talking about sort of some broad, like, we've touched this many lives with our product, and instead being able to say, by providing our service to this many people, we can estimate that this many less people were held pre-trial, and that results in this percent less likelihood of them being convicted, that has these outcomes that reflect on the court systems, on incarceration costs, on the individuals' lives, and the impact to the economy of that. So when you can sort of break these stories down in a real way, I mean, it's such a more powerful, I think, statement. And I think we've, by and large, with all of the portfolio companies that we've added so far, we see this as a value add. We, as part of our diligence process, we start integrating the work with Impactable and our portfolio companies before we've even made a decision whether or not to invest. And part of the reason that we think it's worth spending capital to do that is, it helps with our analysis and understanding of the company, and it's a real value add from our diligence standpoint. And B, the entrepreneur, even if they walked away with a no, if we don't end up making an investment, hopefully they come away with a positive experience, right? And they come away with some value through the process. And that's, something that, I remember from way back in my, engineering career, when we would be hiring, and interviewing individuals, even if we don't end up hiring that person, we want them to walk away with a positive viewpoint, on our company, and a positive experience. And that's, I think, something of value that we can leave behind and then and create. And it certainly creates value for our investors, being able to report, real metrics on the impact that their company is having. From our standpoint, where Richard is talking about how this, allows them to justify, some sales outcomes. From our standpoint, does the same thing. When we talk to LPs, and we pitch to LPs, we're pitching, what kind of social return on investment that we can get them, and we can point to really real numbers, and sort of look forward to the day when this is viewed the same way you would view our auditor who audits our financial reporting. We view Impactable as our auditor that audits our impact reporting.
And just for everyone joining us, I did not bribe Richard and Chris in any way, shape, or form. I appreciate the kind things you're saying. Chris, the vast majority of investors I talk to use surveys. Right? So, tell us a little bit more about your approach to IMM and why you approach it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when you start to rely on standardized surveys, you're limited into sort of understanding the scope of the outcomes that a company is going to create, as well as the scalability of the opportunity, which I think is a really big point of the way we look at these opportunities. By allowing the entrepreneur to develop a very bespoke framework on how they're measuring their impact, and then basically show, like, if we grow at this level, this is how the impact grows. The same way we look at financial projections, which of course, like any investor, you're looking at financial projections with a bit of skepticism. You can do the same thing with impact projections, but it's important to understand what the potential is and what the opportunity is. And I think that kind of understanding is really hard to get with just, some benchmarks and surveys.
Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, I just want to add. So everything, I echo everything that Chris said. And even in situations where you have your impact modeling, you have your impact metrics, not saying that it's going to be the decision maker, it is definitely an amazing tool to help push engagements and deals over the finish line. But even just from the organization's perspective, with the way, again, not to be duplicative, but with the way that technology and just data is being utilized and wielded in this day and age, even if you don't get the deal by way of using not impact lights, but impact metrics, period, it's still good for the organization to have a tool like this because it creates transparency. It enhances the organization's ability to strategically plan because it's all of the data is rooted in tangible primary sources, sometimes secondary sources that can be substantiated. And it just helps with credibility and just allowing the organization to kind of pivot, be malleable also to the audience that they're speaking to in order to, again, tell the story, but also, again, get the individual that they're communicating with kind of on board for the bigger picture that the organization is looking to achieve. Because honestly, without impact metrics, for an organization like Good Call, I can't imagine going back to our traditional methods of trying to communicate usability and scalability. It's kind of just kicked things off into a new hemisphere for us.
I'm so happy to hear that, Richard. Chris, I get asked all the time by founders in particular about how they can prepare from an impact perspective for fundraising and what's required or what's expected from investors at different stages. And so I guess I would ask you, what are you looking for when you consider an investment? Maybe, before you get into the diligence stage, what can founders might maybe do to differentiate themselves at an early stage in a difficult funding climate?
Sure. I mean, when a founder is able to talk about what they're measuring, why they're measuring it, and why that's an important thing to them, is really a big part of the overall, what's the most important part of diligence, particularly at the seed stage? It's the team. It's understanding the team, and it's understanding whether or not it's the right team to move the solution through. And to get at that, you really need to understand that part of the discussion in the impact world, right? What is it that, what's their why, right? And what's their personal experience with this issue that they're trying to solve? And then how have they developed the solution to solve it? And then how are they measuring whether or not it works? And so I think just being able to articulate that part of the story cleanly, it's not so much like, based on what our fund does, I talked about how we're looking to invest in companies that prevent people from going into the system or make a more successful return home or reduce suffering. You could say like, okay, all of our metrics are, recidivism rates and incarceration rates. And so tell us how your solution impacts incarceration rates. And that may be a important thing to do, but I think that it's more valuable to understand the complete picture, because without understanding the complete picture, we may not have made an investment that we didn't understand all of the implications of, all the implications of early access to counsel, right? Or whatever the solution is that the company is trying to solve. And so it's just really a complete understanding of that solution and why that solution is important and how they got there.
And Richard, did you prepare any impact report or work along these lines when you went to raise capital?
So pre-decarceration, we had some traditional strategies, methodologies of how we were choosing to communicate our impact. We obviously have our user satisfaction rating, which is always above 90%, just for the record. We have the number of calls we've routed. We have pretty pivotal stats during the George Floyd protests. I always get this number mixed up, but I think we were able to handle between 8 and 10,000 calls over the course of 3 weeks with a 0% drop rate. And so we just touting a lot of our achievements which we still do now, but was kind of solely what we were relying on prior to engaging with decarceration. I have to commend Chris for, even as an investor, from the VC perspective, you're not really expecting your investor to kind of be as attentive or figuratively invested in the organization and its growth prior to execution of any sort of agreement. And so Chris recommending Catherine and Impactable X in order to quantify our impact, again, not to be duplicative, was a game changer for us, because prior to engaging with decarceration, we were getting very mixed signals from investors because we were not able to track outcome data. The only thing that we were able to kind of tout was our past successes, as well as our user satisfaction rating, which is fabulous. But you can have a user satisfaction rating of like 10 people, in a population of 3 million. So although it is a positive stat, it doesn't speak to the issue from a 30,000 feet up larger perspective. Offering that software and even pushing back and wanting more from us, and to view impact from a different perspective, like viewing it from the impact on the jurisdiction, really did kind of transition the conversation into a more fruitful place, because we were actually able to kind of discuss tangible, finite, primary items that fostered a more transparent and more direct communication with decarceration and other investors, so they can actually understand the scalability of the product in an industry that kind of lacks other capabilities and tools to help communicate that, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. We have a question from Madison. Madison, feel free to come off mute and ask it yourself if you'd like. Just
Yeah. So I was just what you were talking about, Richard, in terms of how it kind of strengthened your relationship and your trust with Chris to have gone through this diligence process, through this impact measurement process with decarceration. And I'm wondering if that's been your experience with other companies as well, Chris, or even with companies that maybe you haven't invested in. Any specific experiences there?
I think, yeah, I think generally speaking, I would say that that both sides see the value in this approach, and it's been, net very positive. As a matter of fact, when it becomes a real sticking point for an entrepreneur, sometimes that's a signal that they may not understand, what they're trying to solve, or why they're trying to solve it, right? And so it is a useful tool, but I have not yet had any kind of experiences like that. All of my experiences with we have 8 portfolio companies so far in the fund, and all doing very different things in this space, and all have been extremely receptive. And with that said, like, entrepreneurs are very busy, right? They're never resourced. They could always use more resources than they have, and asking them to do one more thing is a challenge. So you have to create more value, than you're asking for, or at least equal parts, value. So, the fact that this can, help a company sell their product more easily, it can help them raise money from other investors more easily. All these other things are sort of reasons why we think that this is we haven't gotten, very much pushback or issues, and most actually love being asked to do this.
Chris, I want to bring up, in the time we have left, some of the questions I really hear resounding across the field. One is, who pays, who should pay, who can pay, which gets at the point you just made about founders being so under-resourced. And then there's this other question about, like, LP to investor fund manager expectations being perhaps unclear, standardized. And so I wanted to hear your perspective on that as well, and like what you're hearing from your LPs, particularly as you go to close a fund. Are you being asked for specific things, or is it sort of just, let's see what you've got, and wow, this is far more than we expected, or this is unnecessary, how are you managing your resources? Just kind of curious about the LP to fund manager relationship, and that question of who pays.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different people that you could assign to pay for this. And I think, to your point, it's often more about who can pay versus who gets the value out of it. But our LPs, this is, when we are in fundraising conversations with LPs, we talk about this process. It's now great because we can actually show what we've achieved so far, right? We've got, I think as of the end of last year, I think we realized twice as much value and impact as we've invested, right? And that's, only taking our little percentage of ownership of that impact. So I think our LPs really like that reporting that we're able to deliver to them. It also, frankly, we have got a number of LPs that have, their own impact surveys that they like us to do and report on. And they're pretty easy to fill out, and then we usually follow it up with our, our impact reporting that we're doing, and it's usually, creates great follow-up conversations with them about, how they can better talk about that with folks. And so I think because it's a discussion that we have early on with our LPs when we're fundraising, it's an understanding that there's a cost here, and that impacts the fee structure of the not the fee structure, but certainly the expenses on the fund. But it's valuable to them, and I think it's going to create better financial outcomes as well. So I think I think it pays back very well to the investors at the end of the day.
But when you go to a new investor, a new prospective LP, do they expect something explicit from you? Do they ask you about your impact if you generate an impact report? Do they want to see what SDGs you align with? Do they want to make sure that, you're measuring at the outcome level instead of just the indicator level? I'm just wondering if there's anything more you might be able to share about your experience.
Yes, and all of those things, right? So they are looking for what we're measuring, what SDGs we hit, how we're reporting, and it's usually when we can show an example of an impact assessment that we do in diligence, and when we can show an example of our portfolio-wide impact report, it answers all those questions and more, and actually usually gets folks quite excited. It usually results in, can you introduce me to them, because we want to see how they could be used in other places, right? So I find it's a huge value to our LPs.
I feel like it's a huge value for everyone involved, to be honest.
It is.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of a huge sticking point in a lot of conversations that we have. I mean, Chris has seen many of our decks. We always include impact report metrics in a lot of our decks, because it's interesting to people that are working within the sector, because they're actually interested in impact, and there hasn't kind of been a way, at least to me and to my knowledge, there hasn't been really a finite way of communicating impact in this manner. And so it's always very intriguing to true impact investors. But I've also found for more traditional VCs, it's still very interesting. It's still a sticking point to them, because it's something that they haven't necessarily seen before. And it's something that I find a lot of them, even if the deal does not come to fruition, it's still a huge conversation starter and takes up a lot of time during our pitches, because again, it's something they haven't seen before. It's rooted in finite data, but a lot in some of our conversations, it's opened up new conversations that has led to further engagements within the organization for like maybe their grant making side, or it has even been a kind of a conduit for a lot of these traditional VCs to introduce us to other members or other LPs or other people within their portfolio that would find something like this interesting. And so it kind of has like a sweeping ripple effect, because of what it actually is. It's new, it's finite, and it is a different way of communicating an organization's value to a specific sector. So cheers to Impactable,
I want to invite others to chime in if they have questions. We have another one for Madison here, but Kate, glad to have you on the call. Please feel free to jump in, and others. Madison's asking, what do you mean when you say it's finite?
It's finite because it's numbers. The numbers never lie. And that's essentially what I'm saying. And that it's also a primary resource, because again, it's compiling data and aggregating data that already exists all over the internet. It just hasn't been communicated or aggregated in a way that it actually generates outcome, that it actually generates a story or generates the scalability or value of an organization within that specific sector that they're trying to break into, if that makes sense.
Well, okay, here's from Iris for Chris. How much capital did you raise for a fund and how many companies have you supported?
So we are actually still in the final throes of fundraising process. But we've raised about I guess we're at a little over 9 million in commitments so far. We've deployed a little over 2.5 million so far into 8 companies. And we're building a portfolio of 14 to 16 companies in the over the next couple of years.
I want to ask one final question, which is, what advice would you offer other founders, Richard or Chris, or other fund managers, Chris in particular, when it comes to impact measurement and management? And Richard, we'll start with you.
What advice can I give? I feel like a lot of people in the tech space are almost afraid of data to a degree. A lot of it has to do with because there isn't a lot of data to help substantiate a lot of these claims purposely. As we know, that starting from the top, they're not willing to invest resources in a lot of these justice spaces because it disrupts an already living entity and structure that has kind of been planned out for society. And so don't be afraid of the data. Don't be afraid of the outcome that the data is creating, because it could very well just be a lack of information. I think that I was a research analyst in a past life, and so I love data. Numbers are your best friend. And so what I found is that a lot of people in the justice space, they don't necessarily want to, or kind of unwilling to play with metrics and data because of what it potentially might reveal. And I can understand that now, working in the justice space for the last 4 years. But I think it's important that they understand that it's not a representation of you, your journey, your mission, or in some cases, the organization. It just requires time, patience, and a little bit more curation. If anything, it kind of helps focus your vantage point as to what your end goal is, and it really kind of exemplifies what it is that you need to focus on in order to get to that point. That is really the most meaningful, heartfelt advice that I can give.
Yeah, that's great. Don't be afraid of the data. Chris?
I would say, so if you're developing a fund and you're an impact fund, I think your impact measurement and management approach is something that you need to develop right up front, early on in the process, right? So at the same time you're designing your investment strategy and what your portfolio construction is going to look like and how large you expect the fund to be, all those things, the same thing you should be thinking about, how you're going to address, track, and measure, your impact. How are you going to report to your LPs? How much, what resources are you going to need to commit to this upfront, understanding that, and how you're going to use the data. I think the other important thing is set expectations with the entrepreneurs up front. And I think we hopefully are getting better at this as we move along. Maybe Richard was still pretty early in the process. Maybe we weren't quite as good at that early on, but I think that's really important. Set expectations up front for the entrepreneurs, try and find ways to reduce the lift for them, and make this a value add for those entrepreneurs. And so that it can be a positive experience for everyone.
Thank you both again for taking the time to join us, for such a dynamic and rich conversation.